The morning they tore down my shed, I was in my kitchen, halfway through my second cup of coffee, when I heard the crash. I sprinted outside, still wearing my slippers, and found two men in neon vests kicking apart the last wall of my garden shed like it was a cheap cardboard box. My jaw nearly hit the ground. "What the hell are you doing?" I shouted. One of the guys, looking bored out of his mind, mumbled, "HOA orders." I turned to see Dana Overstreet, the president of our HOA, standing at the end of my driveway with her arms crossed and a smug little tilt to her chin. Dana was exactly the kind of woman you'd expect to be running an HOA mid-50s, frosted bob haircut, tight khakis, and a floral blouse that screamed, "I'm important. You can't just destroy my property," I yelled, storming over to her. She didn't even flinch. "Oscar, your shed was in violation. It didn't match the neighborhood aesthetic. That shed's been here for 6 years. 6 years, Dana." I barked. "You signed off on it when I built it." Dana shrugged like it was an inconvenience. "Well, new guidelines were passed last month. You were notified." I knew that was a lie. I never got any notice. I would have remembered because Dana loved stuffing my mailbox with her passive-aggressive newsletters about lawn heights and mailbox colors. "You're paying for this," I said, pointing at the splintered mess of wood and memories that used to be my weekend sanctuary. Dana just turned on her heel and strutted back toward her golf cart like she was queen of the cul-de-sac. "Take it up with the board," she called over her shoulder. I stood there, my fists clenched, heart hammering. They thought they could bulldoze over me just because they had clipboards and fake authority. Well, they messed with the wrong guy. My name's Oscar Daniels, and I don't roll over for bullies, not even ones hiding behind HOA logos. I spent the rest of that day dragging the remains of my shed into my garage, taking pictures of every broken beam and ripped screw. I dug up every email, every signed approval from 6 years ago. I even found the copy of the old HOA regulations Dana herself had mailed me back then. By nightfall, I had a folder thick enough to slam a courtroom door shut. And believe me, that's exactly what I planned to do. The next morning, I wasn't drinking coffee. I was sitting at the town records office, leafing through public HOA filings with a growing sense of grim satisfaction. It didn't take long to find what I suspected. The so-called new guidelines Dana had waved around like a royal decree weren't properly filed with the town. They hadn't even held a legal vote. My neighbor, Carl Whitman, who worked maintenance at City Hall, caught sight of me poring over the paperwork. "You look like you're gearing up for war," Carl said, pulling up a chair. "I'm gearing up for justice," I replied, tapping the stack of documents. Turns out Dana and her little inner circle never filed the amendments they're using to bulldoze half the neighborhood. Carl whistled low. "That's not just shady. That's illegal." "Exactly." He leaned closer. "You should check if they pulled permits for that demolition." The idea hit me like a lightning bolt. I raced back home, logged onto the town's public permit portal, and searched my address. No demolition permit. No construction notice. Nothing. As far as the town was concerned, my shed was still standing and untouched. They had destroyed private property without authorization. By noon, I was sitting in the office of a local attorney named Grace Holloway. She was sharp-eyed, quick-talking, and loved nothing more than kicking bullies in the teeth through legal channels. After laying out the evidence, she leaned back in her chair, tapping a pen against her notepad. "They've violated municipal code, property rights, and due process," she said. "We've got a strong case for damages and possibly criminal charges for destruction of property." I nodded, feeling the first genuine surge of hope. "There's more," I said. "I think they've been collecting dues and fines based on those fake amendments." Grace's eyebrows shot up. "If that's true, we're talking about fraud." She started drafting a lawsuit right then and there. Meanwhile, I wasn't content to just sit and wait. I printed out flyers, explaining what had happened, complete with copies of the public records and a simple timeline of events. I slipped them into mailboxes all around the neighborhood under the cover of early evening. By the next day, the whole subdivision was buzzing. People were furious. Turns out, I wasn't the only one Dana had targeted. Mrs. Pennington's rose garden had been ripped out for violating plant density rules. The Lopez family had been fined $200 for having a welcome mat that wasn't on the approved list. None of it had been legitimate. 2 mornings later, as I was loading evidence boxes into my truck, a black and white cruiser pulled up to my curb. Officer Jenkins, a calm but no-nonsense guy who'd lived 2 streets over for years, stepped out. "Oscar," he said, tipping his cap. "Got a minute?" "Sure," I said, feeling a jolt of nerves. "We got a complaint about unauthorized demolition," he said, flipping open a small notebook. "Yours?" I explained everything, showing him the photos, the lack of permits, and the paper trail. When I finished, Jenkins nodded slowly. "Sounds like criminal mischief at the very least." He took a few pictures of the damage himself, jotted down some notes, and told me he'd be filing an incident report with the town prosecutor. That afternoon, Grace filed the civil suit. Not just against the HOA as an organization, but personally naming Dana and the board members who had rubber-stamped the new guidelines. Within 72 hours, subpoenas were issued. Dana was served while pruning her front hedges, her face turning the color of an overripe tomato as the process server handed her the envelope. The court date was set for exactly 3 weeks later. In the meantime, the town issued a cease and desist order against the HOA for any further enforcement actions. They were frozen, legally paralyzed. No fines, no letters, nothing. But Dana wasn't the type to back off quietly. The next week, I caught her peering through my living room window while pretending to walk her tiny Pomeranian. She didn't say anything, just stared for a minute too long before waddling off. I installed security cameras the same day. Then, just to make things sweeter, I filed a complaint with the state's Department of Consumer Affairs, who oversaw homeowner associations. Their investigators had teeth and a reputation for sinking them deep. 3 days before the court hearing, a state compliance officer showed up in our neighborhood. A short, wiry woman named Ms. Patel. She had a badge and an attitude that could peel paint. She spent an entire afternoon interviewing residents, collecting documents, and photographing the HOA bulletin boards where Dana had posted her fake amendments. The night before the hearing, I barely slept. I wasn't nervous about losing, I had too much evidence for that. I was nervous about how far Dana would go to try and weasel her way out. The morning of the trial, the courtroom buzzed with murmurs. A dozen of my neighbors showed up, packing the benches behind me. Mrs. Pennington, the Lopezes, even Carl. Dana sat at the defendant's table, looking sour and stiff, flanked by 2 expensive-looking attorneys. Her board cronies sat in a row behind her, whispering and pretending not to be terrified. When the judge, a stern woman named Judge Mallory, took the bench, things moved fast. Grace stood up first, laying out the facts with surgical precision. She presented the missing permits, the unfiled amendments, the photos, the letters, and the timelines. She even showed a short video from my security camera of Dana laughing with the demolition crew right before my shed came down. Dana's attorneys tried to argue that the HOA had verbal approval from the previous town clerk for the new rules. Judge Mallory's eyebrows lifted so high, I thought they might touch the ceiling. "Verbal approval," she said, her voice dripping disbelief. "For statutory amendments affecting property rights?" Dana's lead attorney coughed into his sleeve and muttered something about misunderstandings. It only got worse for them. Ms. Patel from Consumer Affairs took the stand next, explaining how her investigation found systemic fraud, unauthorized fines, and violations of state HOA regulations. By the time Grace rested our case, Dana's team looked like they'd aged a decade. The judge didn't even bother taking a recess. She ruled immediately, slamming her gavel down with a satisfying crack. The HOA was ordered to pay for the full replacement cost of my shed, plus punitive damages for emotional distress and property violation. They were also fined heavily by the state, and Dana and 2 board members were stripped of their positions permanently. More importantly, the association was put under state supervision for the next 5 years, with all decisions requiring oversight and approval from an independent auditor. As Dana shuffled out of the courtroom, her Pomeranian tucked under one arm like a soggy mop, the crowd of neighbors outside began slow clapping. It wasn't planned. It just happened. One by one, people joined in until the sound filled the marble halls like rolling thunder. I didn't say a word. I just walked past her, head high, folder of evidence tucked under my arm, and felt the weight of her petty tyranny finally lift off all our backs. Justice wasn't just served. It was delivered, signed, sealed, and permanently stapled to her record. 2 weeks after the court ruling, an official-looking letter arrived at my doorstep. It was from the county district attorney's office. I tore it open with cautious curiosity, half expecting some bureaucratic follow-up. Instead, the letter explained that a criminal investigation had been formally opened against Dana and the former HOA board members based on evidence of property destruction, fraud, and misuse of community funds. I sat down at my kitchen table, rereading the letter. The part that made me pause was a request for me to provide a full statement under oath regarding the events, including anything I knew about financial activities within the HOA. Apparently, the Consumer Affairs investigation had turned up discrepancies in the HOA's accounting books, leading to suspicions of embezzlement. That same afternoon, a detective named Marcus Bell showed up at my house. He was a tall man with a weathered face and a way of looking at you like he could see right through any half-truths. He introduced himself, showed his badge, and asked if we could talk. As we sat in my living room, he tapped a small recorder on the coffee table and gave me a nod. "I need everything you know," he said. "Not just about your shed. Anything odd you've seen or heard about the HOA finances, elections, or enforcement actions." I thought back. "There was something," I said. "About 2 years ago, they pushed through a beautification fund surcharge. Everyone got billed an extra $50 a month. Supposedly for landscaping upgrades. Did you ever see any upgrades?" Marcus asked. "Not a single one," I said. "We still have the same beat-up benches by the playground, and the front entrance sign is missing 3 letters. Marcus jotted something down. "And," I added, remembering, a few neighbors mentioned that Dana's son started a landscaping company right around then. Somehow, he got the only contract to work in the neighborhood. That made Marcus lean back thoughtfully. "That's exactly the kind of thing we're looking into," he said. "Kickbacks, nepotism, fraudulent billing." Before he left, he handed me his card and told me to call if anything else came to mind. As I watched his cruiser pull away, I realized this wasn't just about my shed anymore. This was about a web of corruption that had been strangling our community for years. The next few weeks were a whirlwind. Subpoenas went out. Bank records started surfacing. It turned out Dana and her cronies had funneled nearly $70,000 from HOA dues into personal accounts disguised as vendor payments. Dana's son's so-called landscaping company hadn't even been licensed. Most of the billing was for work that was never done: phantom tree trims, non-existent mulch deliveries, you name it. Word spread like wildfire. Neighbors who had once been too scared or too apathetic to speak up started coming forward. Mrs. Pennington found receipts for mandatory garden upgrades that had been billed to her without her consent. The Lopezes uncovered a fake lien that had been placed on their property over unpaid fines they never actually owed. A town hall meeting was called at the local community center. It was standing room only. The interim HOA supervisor, appointed by the state, stood at the podium and detailed the full extent of the fraud. People shouted. Some cried. Others just stood there in stunned silence. When the supervisor announced that criminal charges were being filed, multiple counts of fraud, conspiracy, and destruction of property, the room erupted in applause. The same slow clap that had started outside the courthouse now roared like a tidal wave through the hall. Dana wasn't there to hear it. She had already been arrested the day before, quietly taken from her home in handcuffs after a sealed indictment was issued. Her house sat dark and empty after that, the once manicured front lawn turning wild with weeds. Someone eventually nailed a notice to her front door: property seized pending forfeiture. Meanwhile, the neighborhood started to heal. The state-appointed supervisor organized real elections, monitored by the town. For the first time in years, residents got to vote without intimidation or backdoor deals. Carl ran for president and won by a landslide. Mrs. Pennington was elected treasurer. The Lopezes took over the social committee. I stayed out of the leadership race, but agreed to chair the new compliance oversight committee, making sure no future board could operate unchecked. One of our first projects was rebuilding the community trust, literally and figuratively. We organized volunteer weekends to fix up the playground, repaint the entrance sign, and plant real gardens along the main walks. This time, every dollar spent was tracked, and every meeting was open to the public. Grace, my attorney, even helped us draft a new set of bylaws that gave homeowners more power and limited the board's authority. No more secret fines. No more unofficial amendments. No more unchecked demolitions. The best part? My shed was rebuilt, bigger and better than before, paid for entirely by the settlement. I added a small porch, a workbench, and even ran electricity out to it. I called it the Outpost, and it became a neighborhood hub. On weekends, folks would drop by to chat, share a beer, or help with small carpentry projects. One Saturday afternoon, as I was sanding down a birdhouse, Carl wandered over, wiping sweat from his brow. "Hard to believe how far we've come," he said, looking around at the kids playing nearby and the neighbors chatting under the new pavilion. "Yeah," I said, setting down my sander. "Harder to believe how close we came to losing it all." Carl nodded, then added, "You know, if you hadn't fought back." I waved him off. "Wasn't just me. Took all of us." He grinned. "Still. You were the first one who didn't just roll over." I didn't know what to say to that, so I just handed him a cold soda from the cooler. As the sun dipped low and the streetlights flickered on, I realized something. Real community isn't built by rules and fines. It's built by people who are willing to stand up, link arms, and refuse to be bullied. Dana and her cronies had tried to turn our neighborhood into their private kingdom. But in the end, they only taught us how strong we could be when we stood together. And as the laughter and chatter filled the warm evening air, I knew one thing for sure: we would never let it happen again. The summer rolled into its hottest stretch when Detective Bell called again. He asked if I could come down to the precinct. When I arrived, he met me at the front desk and led me into a small interview room where a large folder sat waiting on the table. Bell tapped the folder. We dug deeper into the HOA's financials. Found something we didn't expect. I leaned forward, feeling the air in the room tighten. "Turns out," Bell continued, "the HOA wasn't just skimming money. They were laundering it." I blinked, trying to process it. "The landscaping company Dana's son set up wasn't just fake," Bell said. "It was funneling cash into a shell corporation. That shell was tied to a real estate group buying foreclosed homes, some of which, conveniently, had HOA liens slapped on them after families fell behind on made-up fines." "You're telling me," I said slowly, "they were forcing people into foreclosure so they could buy their homes?" Bell nodded grimly. "At below market rates. Then flipping them." I sat back in my chair, stunned. I thought the shed demolition was the worst of it. I had no idea I had stumbled into something this rotten. "They picked their targets carefully," Bell said. "Mostly elderly homeowners. Families who didn't have the resources to fight back." The words tasted bitter in my mouth. I thought of Mrs. Pennington's scraped-up rose garden, the Lopez's fake lien, the whispered complaints I had overheard at the mailboxes over the years, but never fully understood. Belle pulled out a file and flipped it open, showing me pages of financial trails, signatures, dates, and auction records. "We got enough for a RICO case," he said. "Racketeering. Serious prison time." The case against Dana and her cronies wasn't just about fines and fake amendments anymore. It had climbed into federal territory. Later that week, federal agents descended on the neighborhood. Black SUVs parked along the curbs, and agents in windbreakers combed through Dana's abandoned house, carrying out boxes of documents and computer towers. The Lopezes stood on their porch, watching silently, arms folded tight against their chests. At the next community meeting, Carl called the gathering to order. There was a tension in the air none of us could ignore. Everyone was waiting for the supervisor to speak. "This community," she said, her voice steady, "was exploited by people who abused your trust. But you fought back. You exposed them. And now, they will answer for every bit of damage they caused." Heads nodded around the room. No one clapped this time. It wasn't a moment for celebration. It was a moment for reckoning. By the end of the month, federal indictments were unsealed. Dana, her son, and 3 former board members were charged with racketeering, conspiracy to commit fraud, wire fraud, and destruction of property. The local news picked up the story, plastering their faces across the evening broadcasts. Reporters came knocking, but most of us refused to talk. We had lived through enough spectacle. The town council held a special session, voting unanimously to revoke our HOA's charter. That meant our community would no longer be governed by any homeowners association unless we chose to form a new one with state oversight. We voted overwhelmingly not to. The supervisor stayed on for a few more months, helping us set up a neighborhood council instead, a loose volunteer system where real decisions were made openly, with public minutes and rotating leadership. No more secret meetings. No more backroom deals. I spent the fall helping organize a community festival, something the old HOA had always promised but never delivered. We called it Founders Day, even though none of us were the original founders. It felt right, like we were reclaiming something that had been stolen. On the day of the festival, kids raced through the park with painted faces, adults grilled burgers and hot dogs under tents, and a local band played on a makeshift wooden stage we built ourselves. I manned the raffle booth, watching the easy flow of people, the laughter, the absence of tension that used to cling to every gathering. Carl wandered over, holding a plate piled high with food. "Been thinking," he said between bites, "about putting up a new bulletin board by the front entrance. Real one this time. No fake amendments. Just birthdays, block parties, announcements." "Sounds good," I said. "I'll help build it." He grinned. "Figured you would." As the sun dipped low, painting the sky in streaks of orange and purple, I wandered over to the outpost. I flicked on the porch light and leaned against the railing, watching the festival wind down. Mrs. Pennington sat on a bench, chatting animatedly with the Lopezes. Kids chased each other around the playground, their shrieks of laughter piercing the warm evening air. It struck me then just how much had changed. How close we had come to losing everything: homes, community, trust, all because a handful of greedy people thought they could control us. But we hadn't let them. We stood up. We fought back. We exposed them, dragged them into the light, and made sure they paid for every inch of damage they caused. Weeks later, in federal court, Dana stood before a judge and pleaded guilty to racketeering and fraud. She was sentenced to 12 years in prison. Her son got 8. The other board members scattered lighter sentences, but none of them walked free without punishment. The court ordered restitution. Over $200,000 was to be returned to affected homeowners. It wouldn't erase the harm done, but it was a start. The houses they had flipped were seized by the government and sold properly, with proceeds going to a community fund to repair public spaces. One of the seized homes, A worn-down two-story on the far end of the neighborhood was turned into a community center. We named it Fairway House after our main road. It became a place for tutoring, meetings, and weekend workshops. I taught a woodworking class there that winter, showing kids how to build birdhouses and simple furniture. It felt strange at first to be teaching in a house that had been part of the scheme, but turning it into something good felt like the purest kind of justice. One night, long after the last student had gone home, I locked up Fairway House and stood on the porch, breathing in the cold, crisp air. From here, I could see the lights of the neighborhood twinkling, homes that belonged to real families again. Streets free of fear. Front yards filled with toys and gardens, not regulation signs and violation notices. I thought of my shed, the original spark that had lit this fire. It had been a simple building, nothing special, but it had represented something bigger. The right to live without being bullied, to stand on your own property without fear of petty tyrants. In the end, we didn't just rebuild a shed. We rebuilt a community. And this time, we made it strong enough to stand against anything or anyone who tried to take it away again.